This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello.
The BBC has announced that 415 full-time jobs are being lost in its news and current affairs division.
How can fewer journalists break more and better stories? In Feedback this week, the corporation's Director of News outlines his strategy. Also this week...
You're listening to Staying Out on BBC Radio 1.
Documentaries on Radio's 1 and 1 Extra. Do young listeners really want to listen to an hour-long investigation? How can you keep their attention?
The only downside for me would probably be the length of the documentaries. I mean, 60 minutes, I think it's a bit lengthy time.
And the agony of the Middle East and the controversy over the BBC's reporting of it. Protesters outside the BBC on Tuesday making very clear their view that the BBC's coverage of the conflict in Gaza has been too pro-Israel.
I think it is very one-sided. I don't think they present the Palestinian perspective at all.
Others think the exact opposite.
I can't help feeling that the BBC's reporting of the Israel-Hamas conflict is rather skewed in favour of those living in Gaza.
I'll be talking to the BBC's editor of World News about what is arguably the most difficult conflict for his journalists to report. But first, on Thursday, the BBC announced that 415 jobs are to go from its news division, while at the same time 195 new jobs will be created in the digital area. That's a net loss of 220 full-time jobs. It's the latest in a series of swingeing cuts after the last licence fee agreement. That left the BBC needing to save £800 million in what it calls efficiency savings. What will it all mean for listeners? James Harding is the BBC's Director of News and Current Affairs. I spoke to him in his newsroom. James Harding, even if you didn't have to save £48 million, would you have pushed news in the direction you're now going?
I think in some ways, yes. So the restructuring that we've done to news and current affairs, I think I probably would have been keen to do, because that's been about trying to do three things. One is making sure we have a real focus on current affairs, given how important that is in terms of exploring, explaining the world we live in. Making sure that our daily news programmes really pull together. If you look at today, The World at 1 p.m, The World Tonight, those programmes interrogate the news, actually push forward the news agenda, and making sure that feeds into what we're doing on television, on our rolling news channels, on online. Make sure that that's coming together makes sense. And then the third big element is about the digital transformation of news. And what I mean by that is that news now arrives not just on a television screen or through your radio or even just via your computer. Increasingly it comes in the palm of your hand, in your smartphone. And trying to think about the digital revolution, interactive news, that's a real piece of work for the BBC.
But in terms of listeners to Radio 4 in particular, what's in it for them? You're taking a significant number of journalists out of the BBC. You're increasing the numbers of people who are involved, as it were, with the technology. Our listeners will say, yeah, what about the journalism?
Well, actually, if you look at the way we're spending our money, the area that we're putting most of our investment into is the journalism. I think we're all absolutely clear that nothing matters more than the story. And it was interesting yesterday. You can imagine going through a big round of cost savings with very significant reduction of jobs has an impact on a newsroom. And yet at the end of the day, when you saw the story, what happened with the Malaysian airliner, the beginnings of a ground incursion in Gaza, what you were seeing was people gripped by the story, and nothing matters more in this newsroom than this.
No, but I understand that, and I think a lot of our listeners will say when it comes to dealing with the main stories that are already on the agenda, yes, what you're doing makes sense. But the worry they will have is you're in a single newsroom here in London. You're putting together teams that once worked for different programmes. They're working for a number of programmes. You're combining them. You're bringing in the World Service. There's a great danger that you'll do the big stories well, but your coverage of the stories that need to be dug out, original journalism, will inevitably suffer because you haven't got the people available to do it.
Actually, I don't think that's the case. If you look at where our big commitments are in terms of our spending, they're around two things. Globally, so how do we make sure that the World Service, which operates already in 27 languages, and the World Service English, which delivers to more than 42 million people around the world. How do we take the expertise in the World Service and make sure more of that feeds into what people hear on programmes such as Radio 4? And at the same time, and I think this is really important, let's look at what we've got in our local services.
Look, I just told you on the World Service. Sorry, forgive me. Let's stick on the World Service.
Fair
you
enough.
could say, of course, what you're doing is bringing the talent of the World Service into the main news area. Another way of saying it is you're making sure that the World Tonight on Radio 4 and the World News Hour are edited by the same person and the same production teams. You could say they're going to lose their identity inevitably.
No, but let's just stick with that. Let's stick with the idea of bringing the World Service in. One of the arguments I'm making is you're getting really on-the-ground reporting, on-the-ground insight, courtesy of what's happening in bringing more people from the World Service into our domestic reporting. But at the same time, I think there's a really big issue, not just for the BBC, but for journalism in this country, which is we're going to deliver you the news on Syria, but are we really in step with what's happening in Swindon? Are we going to make sure that we report as closely as possible on what's happening in local communities, regions and the nations of this country? So where we're also making investment is actually in increasing reporters around the country. So rather than stripping away journalism, we're investing in journalism, investing in reporters where we are making savings.
We're taking away dedicated reporters from some areas.
True, and I don't want to pretend that this is an easy business. We, the BBC, have been asked to do all that we do for 26% less. So 26% cut in the total of our resources. So we are having to make sacrifices. Of course that's the case. What I'm saying is that in the way in which we've allocated the resources we have, what we're committed to first and foremost is our journalism.
People here in the centre are news junkies. Of course they're fascinated by Twitter. Of course they're fascinated by what's trending. The majority of listeners aren't. What they care for is original journalism, thoughtful alternative perspectives. How do you protect that at the same time as it were, making your assets work better for you?
I think it's a really good point, and I think the answer lies in that relationship with the audiences. So if you look at our editors, and particularly around radio, particularly in thinking about news that not only reports what's happening in the world, but examines it, interrogates it, a level of revelatory journalism. And I think that is rooted in the expectations of our audiences. And the reason our programmes, such as today, The World at 1, PM, The World Tonight, the reason they work is that they are in ever closer contact with what audiences want. I think we're extremely clear that those programmes in particular are the moment where you say not only what's happened, but try and understand what it means.
And finally, there is strike action planned in the BBC. Journalists say that they've seen their real pay go down in real terms. Over the next month or so, do you expect listeners at home to notice a significant disruption in news coverage?
As you say, there is strike action planned. I mentioned that the BBC is facing this 26% cut, and it is true that journalists here have faced cuts in real terms over recent years. So yes, there is quite a lot of pent-up frustration. Our job, my job, is to try and do everything we can on the planned day of strike action next Wednesday to make sure that doesn't disrupt services.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
The BBC's Director of News and Current Affairs, James Harding. And, of course, if you want to comment on anything to do with BBC Radio, you know what to do. You can write to Feedback, PO Box 67234, London SE1P4AX, or leave a phone message on 03 333 444 544. Standard landline charges apply, but it could cost more on some mobile networks. Or you can send an email to feedback@bbc.co.uk, and you can tweet us at @BBCR4Feedback. All those details are on our website. And now, the conflict between Hamas and Israel.
4 Palestinian children, all cousins, have been killed in an Israeli attack as they played on a beach in Gaza. The Palestinian group Hamas described the attack as a war crime. The Israeli military says it's investigating, but said it had been targeting militants who've been launching rocket attacks on Israeli cities.
As usual, the hostilities have been marked by claim and counterclaim. As the rockets blast off towards Israel and the bombs fall down upon the Palestinians, a propaganda war is also being fought, with both sides vying for airspace to plead their causes. Emotions are running high, not least amongst listeners and viewers of the BBC's coverage. On Tuesday, a crowd of protesters gathered outside New Broadcasting House in London, which houses the BBC's news centre, to demonstrate against what they see as Israel's aggression against the people of Gaza and the BBC's pro-Israel coverage of the conflict. A similar demo was held outside Media City in Salford last Saturday, and many feedback listeners claim they can detect a pro-Israeli bias in the corporation's coverage.
My name's Jean Fitzpatrick and I live in London. I wish the BBC would give more time to hear the Palestinian voice, the Palestinian side. So it's not so much that it's only about Israel, but we don't hear the Palestinian voice and the Palestinian situation.
My name's Jenny Hardacre, calling from Cambridge. Current coverage, I think it is very one-sided. I don't think they present the Palestinian perspective at all, and they don't give enough information about the historical context. I don't think it's only biased. I think they censor the Palestinian viewpoint.
But there is also a similar number of feedback listeners who take the opposite view, that the BBC's coverage is anti-Israel in its tone.
My name's Mitch Hanson. I can't help feeling that the BBC's reporting of the Israel-Hamas conflict is rather skewed in favour of those living in Gaza. The emphasis appears to be on how terrible it is for Gaza to be subjected to bombardment by Israeli forces, while very little is said about how terrible it is for Israelis to live in fear of constant rocket attacks originating from the territory.
My name is Molly Cooper. How is it that there was no mention of rockets fired on Israel until the IDF began to bomb terrorist targets? It's true I'm elderly, but I do look back with nostalgia to the days when the BBC could be relied on as being more objective, dispassionate in its reporting.
Now, a simplistic view might be to say that if the BBC is getting complaints from both sides, they must be getting it just about right. Another interpretation, of course, is that they are getting it badly wrong. Andrew Roy is the world editor of BBC News.
It's very difficult to report on the ground because our reporters are at physical risk. So in that regard, it is very difficult. It is also one of our most closely monitored conflicts that we cover. So
by that you mean that pressure groups are onto you all the time?
Everything we do is closely scrutinised, whether you would call them pressure groups. We are closely scrutinised by both sides is the easiest way to describe it. We do get both sides having quite sophisticated machines that move in very rapidly to try and influence our coverage. We get an awful lot of guest offers from both sides, and we have to navigate our way clearly, accurately, impartially, objectively through that. So it is difficult in that regard, yes.
But some who support the Palestinians, for example, would say that you are not reporting things like the demonstrations outside Broadcasting House that happened in support of the Palestinian case, where they claim 5,000 people were present. Why didn't you report that?
We try and report the conflict on the ground as accurately as we can. We try and select guests so that both sides get a fair hearing. The protests here in London were reported. We gave them the prominence we thought they were due. It was a day when an awful lot of other stories were happening here in the UK, the cabinet reshuffle, for instance, but there was an awful lot happening in Israel and Gaza, which we also reported.
The main criticism of those who were demonstrating in favour of the Palestinians is that you failed to provide a proper context. They would say, for example, or a petition they presented said, "We'd like to remind the BBC that Gaza is under Israeli occupation and siege, and that Israel is bombing a refugee population." And their concern is that that context is largely, if not totally, absent from BBC reporting.
I reject it, the fact that they are saying it is totally absent. We give an awful lot of context. We give the historical context. We can't give it in every 30-second or 60-second or 90-second news report we do. But we've got it on our website. We refer people to it constantly. We make sure that when we have the space, we do include the historical context. But we can't, in every single report, include the entire context of a historical conflict going back generations.
Well, from the other side, of course, there's those who would say you're not giving a proper sense of what it's like to have rockets coming in and the threat of rockets, where your children go to school, there's a rocket going to come out of the sky in a moment, what it's like to be like that. And they also say that you didn't report in the run-up to the present conflict previous rocket attacks.
Well, no, that's just not right either. We have teams on the Israeli side that are reporting. We give due balance to both sides. We have teams in Gaza. We have teams in Israel. We are reporting accurately and fairly both sides of the conflict.
To what extent is the coverage of the conflict conditioned by the ease of access? Israel is a relatively easy place to broadcast from, to operate within. The Israeli government has a large number of spokespeople. In Gaza, by contrast, it's very difficult, isn't it, to operate. A lot of people don't speak English very well, and also some of the people you would wish to speak to may at any moment be targeted. They're not going to tell you, for example, yes, I'll turn up at X in half an hour's time to do an interview, because in doing so they might be endangering their lives.
The BBC is one of the few international broadcasters that has a permanent presence in Gaza. So we are there on the ground in Gaza. It is difficult to operate there. You know, people are under bombardment, but we do operate there, and we do our absolute best to make sure we get the point of view from Gaza. At the same time, we are reporting from Israel as well.
Of course, language is crucial in this. What you call things. Do you call them terrorists, freedom fighters? Do you talk about the fence, the security fence, or the wall, or whatever? If listeners want to know what you've decided, what terms you've decided to use and why, how can they find out?
They can go to the BBC Academy website, which is where the College of Journalism puts our guidelines. That's freely available to anyone.
Andrew Roy, the world editor of BBC News. Now, last week, even before the latest cuts were announced, we discovered that Radio 4's long-running investigative series, Face the Facts, is being cancelled after a final run early next year. And a number of you do not want to have to face that fact.
Hello, my name's Pam Holland. I listen to the exceptionally fine and penetrating Face the Facts, 1,000 Philomenas, about the experience of young unmarried women and their babies in Belfast.
All over this slope now have sprung up all these unofficial memorials, crosses and angels. What marked the grave of your friend's child all those years ago?
Nothing, absolutely nothing.
The investigative journalism was of the highest order, and the programme made for thought-provoking, involving and moving listening. This is the standard of broadcasting for which the BBC is internationally renowned. Please, BBC, do not cut this programme.
My name is Leslie Scott from Harrow. This is the only programme which deals seriously with fraud, public accountability and compliance with regulations. Face the Facts carries the weight of the BBC reputation and offers a chance of retribution to people and firms who have suffered loss or even injury.
And we'll miss you too, John. Especially moments like this.
Mr. Sage, I'm John Waite from Radio 4.
Would you like to leave the premises? Otherwise
I'm here to record an interview with Mr. Sage about your... Mr. Sage, please don't push me, Mr. Sage.
Why don't you have me for a sort? And I'll pick you up the premises. Mr. Sage! I have a promise. Mr. Sage! I want to talk...
Well, his insurance premium should be less anyway. Now, if you think hard-hitting investigative journalism and gritty documentary making is the preserve of Panorama or Radio 4, think again. The BBC's youth station, Radio 1, has been making documentaries for 40 years this year, and its news strand, Newsbeat, is also celebrating its 40th birthday. Radio 1 documentaries are enjoying something of a renaissance, picking up a slew of awards from the radio industry. Most recently, Radio 1's Tempted by Teacher won gold at this year's Radio Academy Awards for its unflinching story of pupil and teacher relationships.
Now, what's coming up is pretty heavy and includes some graphic details of serious sexual abuse between teachers and pupils.
The stories range from tough subjects like abusive relationships and suicide to in-depth profiles of the biggest pop stars. The industry has recognised the documentary's worth, hence the prizes. But they could be a tough sell for some teenagers that are an hour long and their speech programmes on a music station. So are they just a duty turn, or are they genuinely popular with the network's listeners? Feedback asked Radio 1 and 1Extra listener Claire, who's been Feedback's guide to Radio 1 in the past, and some of her friends, to listen to Tempted by Teacher, to another recent story called Staying Out about young people trying to stay out of prison, and to Suicide Survivors, presented by rapper Professor Green.
Hi, I'm Claire, I'm 22, I'm from Liverpool, and I'm a regular listener of Radio 1. I like the way they use a young voice. I think actually getting it from first hand and from someone who's been through it, it's a lot more real.
I forgot how much that affected my self-esteem, being inside, knowing that you were bad.
I think the music, the way they dip them in and out, keeps it lively for me as a listener. The only downside for me would probably be the length of the documentaries. I mean, 60 minutes, I think it's a bit lengthy time.
Hi, I'm Matt. The Suicide Survivors one I found really interesting. I quite like the choice of, I think it was Professor Green that was hosting it.
Emma's a suicide survivor, and suicide has affected my life too. 6 years ago, my dad took his own life.
In the eyes of some young people, if you've got someone they look up to in that sense presenting it, and I thought suicide issues is something that really isn't covered enough in media at the moment.
Hello, my name's Rebecca. I think the Radio 1 documentaries are excellent. The Tempted by Teacher one. It's wonderful to know that such a taboo topic is being covered and that we're being told that there's actually help out there and things you can do about it.
It's important that anyone who's being abused or maybe at risk of abuse talks to someone about what is happening to them as soon as possible.
To be honest with you, I thought the music was a little bit much for me. I felt that it was being used as a filler. A smaller section of the song would have been much better. It would have then shortened the length of the documentary a little, and I kind of found myself going elsewhere. I just feel the music was a bit much.
The views of just some of the audience. So how do you get teenagers listening for a full hour to a documentary? And are Radio 1 and 1Extra just fulfilling an obligation to tell young people about what they should know about, rather than what they actually care about? I asked Piers Bradford, the commissioning editor for Radio 1 and 1Extra, whether docs are something they have to do.
It's actually in our service licence agreement that we have to do documentaries, but it's become far more than something that we're forced to do. I think Radio 1 has got an obligation to be distinct, and all the way back to Reithian values of educate, inform and entertain, our documentary output is very much an integral part of that. So alongside our Newsbeat output or our social action output, having an hour-long doc every week I think is really important.
Just let's talk briefly about the subjects you choose. What's the balance you try to achieve between those that deal with real problem issues like drugs or prison and light-hearted things? How do you go for choosing a balance between the two?
I just try and work out which ones are going to connect best with our audience. And I want to keep that feeling that there's a real variety of tone in that slot.
And what sort of response do you get? I mean, because if somebody does call back and is deeply troubled about something, what do you do? I mean, have you got something in place?
Yeah, so if we're doing the harder-hitting subject matters, then there's a BBC Action line set up, which gives further avenues for people to explore to go and get help. And then in terms of feedback from our audience, one of the brilliant things now about social media is that you can monitor the conversations about which bits they liked, particularly if it's around a sort of pop band with a very avid fan base. You can really tell the bits that get them excited.
These documentaries go out at 9 p.m. Did people start switching off by about 9:10 or not?
We haven't seen any greater dip-off during the documentary slot than comparable slots throughout the week. It's very similar in terms of both the number of people that listen and also the length of time that they listen for.
Claire Stroy, if I can talk to you about producing these programmes and the way in which you do them, the style. You represent an independent producer, something else that does a number of these things. What are the things not to do?
I think the thing that you always have to think of is the audience. It's at the heart of what we do. So a good example of one that we did recently, which is probably what to do rather than what not to do, is one called Divided Loyalties, which was a story about being mixed race, and it's presented by one of the 1Extra DJs,
DJ Semtex.
Semtex, yeah. And that's a really great example because DJ Semtex is mixed race, and it's a story that's incredibly personal to him, and the way in which we told the story was through his own words.
Being mixed race, I experienced racism and ignorance in many different ways. Sometimes it was like straight to your face, and sometimes it was kind of subliminal.
And rather than sort of getting experts in going, this is what it means to be mixed race, these are the statistics, we told the story through telling Semtex's story. We do, of course, hear from the experts because it's important, but they're not sitting sort of on high.
Now, Claire, you oversee some Radio 4 documentaries as well. If you tried to put the amount of music underneath the Radio 4 documentary you do on this one, there'd be a riot. But sometimes do you play too much? We heard somebody, a listener at the beginning, say, you're playing an awful lot of music there. Are you padding out an hour?
It's an interesting question. I think music within Radio 1 Stories is incredibly important. It can either be used to really illustrate a point, or it can be used to really punctuate the conversation as well. Radio 1 is a music station. The whole point of Radio 1 Stories is that they're so integrated within the rest of the Radio 1 schedule, I would say. And it's not like you're suddenly coming to this big sort of gear change at 9 p.m. on a Monday night. It sounds like Radio 1. It is Radio 1.
Piers, do you have a problem with it being an hour long? Would you rather do 2 half-hour programmes? Now, we all know that it's cheaper to make an hour-long programme than a half-hour programme. So it's one of the reasons the programme's an hour long, because it's cheaper.
I think we've got a very set schedule and the slots that we have are an hour long. But I think there's loads of examples, especially in television, of strong, factual documentary programmes that are an hour long that manage to engage a young audience.
But are there any subjects which are taboo that you would not do in this documentary form? Or
No.
Do you think you can do anything?
I think my main motivation is this issue relevant to our young audience? If it is, then I think we do it. Being within the scope of a documentary programme, it allows you to tackle subjects, talk about language that you wouldn't do at any other point on the network. I wouldn't do a subject for the sake of it and make it sensationalist, but as long as there was sort of a relevant editorial reason for doing it.
And you had the right person to present it.
The right format or the right presenter, then I'd do it.
My thanks to commissioning editor Piers Bradford and to executive producer Chloe Straw from Something Else Productions. Now another unkind BBC cut. The victim is the clearly much beloved weekly blog about In Our Time, written by Lord Bragg of Wigton. The announcement that the blog is being discontinued because of economies in BBC Radio caused much disquiet in the hearts of his loyal followers and prompted Jackie Meredith to propose a novel way to keep the blog going.
It's given me a huge amount of pleasure. It's made me able to wander around London vicariously. And I can't imagine how much money it costs, but I would have thought it's a trifling, a piffling amount, and I'd like to even suggest that many of us who've enjoyed this for years contribute towards its carrying on. I'm willing to chuck in a £5. Anyway, thank you, Melvyn Bragg, for the lovely service, and boo to the BBC for depriving us of it.
Not sure how many £5 notes would be needed to fund a return of Melvyn's blog. My blog remains, however, presumably because it's much cheaper in every way. Goodbye. This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello.
The BBC has announced that 415 full-time jobs are being lost in its news and current affairs division.
How can fewer journalists break more and better stories? In feedback this week, the corporation's Director of News outlines his strategy. Also this week,
You're listening to Staying Out on BBC Radio 1.
Documentaries on Radios 1 and 1 Extra. Do young listeners really...
In some ways, yes. So the restructuring that we've done to news and current affairs, I think I probably would have been keen to do, because that's been about trying to do three things. One is making sure we have a real focus on current affairs, given how important that is in terms of exploring, explaining the world we live in. Making sure that our daily news programmes really pull together. If you look at today, The World at 1 p.m, The World Tonight, those programmes interrogate the news, actually push forward the news agenda, and making sure that feeds into what we're doing.
That's a net loss of 220 full-time jobs. It's the latest in a series of swingeing cuts after the last licence fee agreement. That left the BBC needing to save £800 million in what it calls efficiency savings. What will it all mean for listeners? James Harding is the BBC's Director of News and Current Affairs. I spoke to him in his newsroom. James Harding, even if you didn't have to save £48 million, would you have pushed news in the direction you're now going?
I think very one-sided. I don't think they present the Palestinian perspective at all.
Others think the exact opposite.
I can't help feeling that the BBC's reporting of the Israel-Hamas conflict is rather skewed in favour of those living in Gaza.
I'll be talking to the BBC's editor of World News about what is arguably the most difficult conflict for his journalists to report. But first, on Thursday, the BBC announced that 415 jobs are to go from its news division, while at the same time 195 new jobs will be created in the digital area. You want to listen to an hour-long investigation? How can you keep their attention?
The only downside for me would probably be the length of the documentaries. I mean, 60 minutes, I think it's a bit lengthy time.
And the agony of the Middle East and the controversy over the BBC's reporting of it. Protesters outside the BBC on Tuesday making very clear their view that the BBC's coverage of the conflict in Gaza has been too pro-Israel.
I think it is very